From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. We've got an excellent show for you today, as always. And today we're going hard after the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So fasten your seatbelts. For that, we're going to be talking to Lori Wallach from Public Citizen's Global Trade Watch. She's going to give the latest on what's happening on the TPP. And we're also going to be talking to an old friend of Ralph's, and I'm proud to say an old friend of mine too. Speaker, author, and one of the all-around good guys, the incomparable Mr. Jim Hightower. We're going to hear the latest from our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And we should be able to, this episode, to get some more listener questions. Our shows have been so jam-packed lately, it's been difficult to fit those in. But I think we're going to do it this time. David, introduce us to our first guest today, please.
Steve, did you know that there's nothing in the middle of the road but a yellow stripe and dead armadillos?
I did not know that.
Did you know that the only difference between a pigeon and the American farmer today is that a pigeon can still make a deposit on a John Deere?
I was unaware of that also.
Did you know that the opposite for courage is not cowardice, it is conformity? Even a dead fish can go with the flow.
Now, well, that sounds vaguely familiar to me now.
Well, that is some of the wit and wisdom of our guest today. Jim Hightower is a syndicated columnist, national radio commentator, progressive political activist, and author who served from 1983 to 1991 as the elected commissioner of the Texas Department of Agriculture. He is the author of many books, including If the Gods Had Meant Us to Vote, They'd Have Given Us Candidates, and Swim Against the Current, Even a Dead Fish Can Go with the Flow.
That's where I heard that.
He puts out a monthly newsletter called the Hightower Lowdown. He's America's #1 populist. The late, great political columnist Molly Ivins once said, if Will Rogers and Mother Jones had a baby, Jim Hightower would be that rambunctious child, mad as hell with a sense of humor. Jim Hightower, it's an honor. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Well, it's a joy to be with you, and what a combination we have here. We got Ralph Nader and then Scrovan and Feldman, so this is seriously funny. Is that right?
That's one of my favorite phrases, seriously funny. And that's what you convey to your audiences all over the country. A few people, Jim Hightower, have spoken to so many live audiences in so many states, red states, blue states. You've spoken before evangelically oriented people. You've spoken before hard rock progressives in New England. And so this leads to my first question. When you put out your populist or progressive agenda for America and its relations to the world, do you really see that much divide between your Southern audiences and, say, your Midwest or California or New England audiences?
Not really, and I know that, Ralph, that you do the same thing. And the truth is, in my view, the real political spectrum in America is not right to left, liberal, conservative. Those are theories, but rather it's top to bottom. That's experience. That's where people live. It's their zip code. And they know, a good 80% of the American people know that they're no longer in shouting distance of those powers at the top, whether those powers call themselves Democrat, Republican, liberal, or conservative. So when you talk to people in terms of just the basics of what's going on in America and what their situation is, when you talk to them about not just jobs, but wages, when you talk to them about clean air and water, the opportunity for their kids to be able to go to college or to get a higher education, a technical degree, or to talk to them about any of the fundamentals in life, including health care for everybody, they're with you. And it doesn't matter, again, whether you're talking to somebody who considers themselves conservative or considers themselves liberal.
Well, let me go to what I call the democracy gap. There is a lot of converging opinions by people who label themselves conservatives or liberals or progressives or libertarians. There's no doubt. I mean, I found 24 converging areas, whether it's the civil liberties intrusions of the Patriot Act or a restored minimum wage or the Pentagon and military-industrial complex, enormous waste and corruption and even empire. There's an increasing conservative concern about sprawling military bases and interventionism. Ron Paul has expressed that, for example. And, of course, top of the list is what the right wing calls crony capitalism and what we call corporate bailouts or corporate welfare. So tell us what you think are the best approaches to take this converging opinion about what kind of society, country, world they want to live in into political, civic action, electoral action. That's where the gap is, because look at that crew that's running for the Republican nomination. It's like a circus, and it's not all that much better on the Democratic side in terms of who the lead runner is, with Hillary Clinton being the corporatist and militarist, increasingly challenged by the progressive Senator Bernie Sanders. So let's talk about the democracy gap. What if someone stands up in an audience in Texarkana or Durham, New Hampshire, and says, okay, Mr. Hightower, we agree, 1, 2, 3, 4. Why aren't we organizing as a people? What are the obstacles? How do you overcome this lack of civic motivation going to the next step?
Well, I think there are at least two obstacles there. One is the lack of leadership from people in so-called leadership positions. So they don't want us talking to each other, and then they get the media to cooperate with them to say that we're all enemies. Well, we're not. We're natural allies. Labor with farmers, farmers with environmentalists, environmentalists with poor people, et cetera. And when we can just go out there and talk to people about specific issues, as you found, Ralph, then things begin to happen. People begin to nod their heads together. And so that's the first place to start, is what is it that we have in common? And you had that great meeting earlier this year in Washington with conservatives and with progressives coming together to talk about some of the things that we actually agree on. You mentioned your 24 points of convergence. There's at least that many. We see it happening right now with this Trans-Pacific Partnership scam that Obama is trying to shove down our throats. I mean, there's a supposedly liberal Democrat pushing through just a corporate wet dream for global corporations in this case. And the most disgusting thing about that, in addition to its actual provisions, is Obama continuing to say that with this TPP agreement, we are writing the rules of global engagement rather than letting the Chinese and other countries write it. Well, we're writing the rules to gut our own people. How disgusting is that? If they were writing the rules, we would expect that. But here he's saying we're writing the rules, and those rules are going to work against the workaday people of this country. So, but that's...
And the corporations are writing the rules, in effect.
Oh, of course. Yeah, 500 corporate executives and lobbyists sat there with the trade representatives and wrote this document. And even a member of Congress couldn't be there to observe it, much less participate, and then much less just regular folks, of course, were shut out. Ralph said there's a saying in negotiation, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Well, let's take this example, because it's going to come up next year before Congress, probably, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. For those who don't know much about it, it's a trade deal masquerading as a trade deal, because it isn't just tariffs and quotas. It basically damages seriously and displaces our democratic institutions, courts, legislatures, executive branch. It bypasses them. Anytime we want to improve our labor, consumer, environmental standards, they can be labeled by some other less developed country as a non-tariff trade barrier, violating the agreement, and they take us to these secret tribunals, and we lose. So it's a pull-down trade agreement on our domestic standards of living, not to mention, as you implied, the shipping of whole jobs and industries to what I call fascist and communist regimes overseas. So let's take this. Okay, the people should block this through their members of Congress. There are 535 members of Congress, 50 senators, 435 representatives. They put their shoes on every day like you and I and others. How would you start organizing a new pot-boiling watchdog group in every congressional district? As you know, everything starts with one or two people, so they can increasingly take that opposition to this agreement by both left and right in their district and give it the laser beam focus on Capitol Hill. Already, it's about a 50-50 split. I mean, we're not starting from zero. About half of the members already oppose it, but the arm twisting has yet to come from the White House and the corporate lobbyists. So let's get very specific. how would we start this rumble, this laser beam focus in every congressional district against the TPP? And if we beat the TPP, we're starting to roll back globalization. It'll be such a stunning defeat for Wall Street and the White House and people like Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, the cheerleader of globalization.
Any movement starts when somebody moves. And the good news here is that this movement already is underway, thanks to Lori Wallach at Public Citizen with the Global Trade Watch program over there. She has been, and her staff of only 11 people have made this thing an issue by doing just exactly what you're saying, by going out with road shows and talking to other constituent groups that are going to be screwed by this deal, getting them involved, getting them talking to their members, and then also just going on the road and going into those communities, go into churches, go into your civic clubs, go into the pubs and the saloons, go to the coffee clutches, go anywhere there are people and just show them what this thing is. Lyndon Johnson used to say you can't make chicken salad out of chicken manure. He didn't say manure, but nonetheless, a very good point. And that's all they've got to work with, the proponents of this TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. This thing is just a pile of manure for corporate interests against the public interest. So just presenting it to the people is going to be enough, because anybody who sees it, anybody who takes a peek at this thing, just has an automatic gag reflex. So we've got to do that, and do that not just in the progressive congressional districts, but particularly out there with those Tea Party people. I mean, my God, they were elected on the basis of challenging business as usual in Washington. You cannot get more business as usual than this TPP scam, and why their members are mostly standing up for this so-called agreement, which we do not agree with, but nonetheless, they're the ones who are really pushing this thing through. And I think you can turn a lot of those people around by going to their own constituents and the local Tea Party leaders and that sort of thing. So we've got to not make assumptions about who people are, just go out there and present these facts in the most forceful way that you can. Well, one example is, Donnie Trump's already come out against this thing. So, we start with a convergence of political outlook and parties on this thing. And as you say, we've got great numbers in the Congress already with us. So this is a very winnable thing, and we've just got to be the ones who go out there and hammer it home.
Yeah, and I think if they go to globaltradewatch.org, which is the Public Citizen, which has developed efforts all over the country, they'll get a lot of material that they can use in clear English, very accurate 1, 2, 3 material. For example, the Obama administration hasn't even revealed the full text. It's still secret. There are little snippets that leak out here and there. But here they want to ram this down the throat of the American people, and they're dragging their feet just like George Herbert Walker Bush and Clinton did on NAFTA and the World Trade Organization. So the next step, I think, Jim, is to have enough people in each congressional district to summon their legislators, to summon their senators and representatives to town meetings, where the audience shapes the agenda. That's why I use the word summons, a citizen summons. I've even drafted citizen summons for people. And once they come back, and they get an experience of what is in an informed audience, they're going to be pretty shaken. Because as you say, the only argument for the TPP is corporate supremacy over our country and the world. That's what it is. It's going to raise the price of medicines. It's going to empty out communities in terms of jobs. It's going to weaken air and water pollution controls. It's going to subordinate higher food safety and food labeling laws. It's going to even go into whether we can control the way banks invest or not invest in neighborhoods. Let's take it to the next step. Let's say these members can't deny the summons. There's enough citizens on the petition where they can't deny it, and they're people who are conservative and liberals, and that's what scares a lot of these lawmakers when there's a convergence like that. So they're in a town meeting, more than one, in their district during their congressional recess, etc. And the place is full. It's got very knowledgeable people. They've got material from Global Trade Watch and other sources. And the legislators standing or sitting up there on the stage or before a podium. Run it out. Let's say you were in the audience. What would be the next step to get them more committed. The ones that are already committed to become persuaders in the corridors of Congress with others who are not their colleagues.
An important step in all of these kinds of campaigns, and I agree with you, there's no need to go to Washington to talk to your member of Congress. They have district offices. They have meetings of their own. So, show up, as Woody Allen says. That's more than half of achieving anything is just being there and get in the face of power and grab these Congress critters by the short hairs. But I think an important step is for people to be able to see progress. And so the degree to which a member is affected by these meetings, these summonses and confrontations, the degree to which somebody from across the country another Congress critter is persuaded, that's information that has to get out so people can begin to see the result of their actions. And then that emboldens them to do more. One thing that Laura Wallach and the Global Trade Watch people did was to have drop-ins and hangouts at congressional offices, district offices. In other words, a dozen or 30 citizens would show up at the office and hang out for like 2 days. And, making the point that we're here, we're the citizens, we pay taxes, we are the people you're supposed to be responsive to, not those Wall Street bankers, and just, do that. And then creative stuff. The Global Trade Watch people at the actual trade negotiations that were taking place out in Hawaii earlier this year set a new Guinness Book of Records for the number of conch shells that could be blown at 6 a.m. in front of the luxury hotel where the negotiators were staying. So they got a nice little wake-up call with 400 conch shells blowing their way. So
there's a lot of fun in this.
Exactly.
First, in getting the members of Congress who are on your side to be more vigorous in persuading their reluctant colleagues in the Senate and the House, but also in making the ones that are really in the pockets of the corporations squirm. Because they're used to town meetings, where people are not really up on the issues, or just some person just blasts forth emotionally without much factual content, and they sort of smile and listen and cool them off. But with Global Trade Watch and the material you have, you're going to show that you, in the audience, know more than the member of Congress. I mean, when the World Trade Organization agreement was before Congress, we offered $10,000 to the favorite charity of any senator or representative who would subject themselves in an open committee to 10 questions about the text. And we got no takers until just 10 minutes before 5, when it was a deadline that we gave them. Senator Hank Brown, Republican of Colorado, called up and said, I'll take it. I don't want you to give $10,000 to my favorite charity. I'll take it. So he reserved a Senate Foreign Committee room, and me and Richard Goodwin asked the questions. We asked him 12 questions. He got every one of them right, proving that he was the only member of Congress who even read this 500-600-page agreement. We've been talking to Jim Hightower, who is a great progressive communicator. He was formerly Texas Commissioner of Agriculture. He won a statewide election and was on his way to another re-election before a political smear against some of his associates dislodged him in favor of Rick Perry, who then went on to become a long-time governor of Texas. He just dropped out of the presidential race. Tell us about your newsletter, which is one of the most widely circulated newsletter, 4 pages, I guess, that is reaching tens of thousands of households. Why don't you describe it, its frequency, its content, and how people can subscribe to it?
It's a monthly political newsletter that focuses on these very kind of issues we've been talking about. Populist perspective presented there as succinctly as my little brain is able to condense things, but yet convey the essence of what's really going on. The establishment media, they're good at the who, what, when, and where, but they never get to the why. And that's what we try to do in this puzzle. Why is this happening, and what's really behind it, and who is really behind it in terms of the corporate powers. And then, as you mentioned, it's only 4 pages because we don't want it to be intimidating and to be another thick magazine that you just have stacked up there. So it comes out monthly, got more than 100,000 subscribers to it, and as you suggest, it's traded around. People take it to their meetings, they take it to work and circulate it, they send copies to their family, and et cetera. So it's put it on bulletin boards, and that sort of thing. So the word gets out.
How do they get it? Tell the listeners how they can get it, and give them examples of some of the themes of recent newsletters. You have actually themes of hot issues that you really bore into, with some pretty interesting satire once in a while to make it really humming.
And then we always have a do something box. So it's not just, get mad about this. It's here's a way to connect with other people who are doing something, other groups about this. Well, the themes range from the deliberate privatization move against our public post office and refuting the canard that the post office is going broke. It's only going broke because an act of Congress under George W. Bush saddled them with $5 billion a year in pension payments that no other corporation or government agency would have to pay. So the post office is making an operating profit. We took on the issue of for-profit colleges and how they are sinking students into an unbearable debt, and then them profiting by taking the student loan money the government puts forward for those kids. So that's another dramatic thing. And then we do things like on Labor Day this year, we talked about the first Labor Day. Where did this come from? And the powers that be, the history books, try to say, well, it came from Grover Cleveland. He was the president who got this thing through, making it a federal holiday, Labor Day. Well, hogwash. It was 20,000 people on the street in 1882. People, labor unions on the street with bands, with examples of their work that they did, with floats and all sorts of it was a gala event, but it wasn't just to celebrate, it was to protest. It went right up Fifth Avenue, right across the robber barons' mansions there, labor confronting them with the fact that they're making $2 a day and having to work 12-hour days, 6 days a week. So that forged movement came out of that. And so we try to do little bits like that tell the people's history, the real history that you're not going to get from history classes. And then this is available to everybody. It's only $15 a year, so it's cheap. It's fairly pithy. It's short, and it's interesting because it's activist. So as I say, we've got about 100,000, more than 100,000 subscribers, and they're all activists. They call themselves lowdowners. So there's anywhere I go in the country, any speech I give or whatever, they're there. They show up because they want to be involved in these issues and want to make a difference. So that's the type of newsletter it is. You can get by going to jimhightower.com, and then also we've got the website of the Lowdown itself, which is hightowerlowdown.org.
Thank you, Jim, for telling the listeners how to get your newsletter. Like that issue you had on the first Labor Day, look how relevant it is today. Labor Day has now been turned into Sales Day, and the number of Labor Day parades has shrunken enormously. And even in a place like Detroit, major union town, there are only a few hundred on the parade. So when you look at the history of it, and what is a day of protest, a day of turnout, a day of marching, a day of focus, a day of demand, you say, well, if they did it in 1882, why can't we do it now, resurrect the whole spirit of Labor Day, and stream some of these marches to even larger audiences? So that's the importance of history. I remember a couple of years ago or more, you had a whole issue on the minimum wage. This was an issue that stagnated after 2008, despite Obama's pledge that he was going to raise it during the 2008 campaign. And then it didn't take more than the population of New Britain, Connecticut, in terms of marches and demos in front of Walmart and McDonald's and Burger King and some of the think tanks and some of our work and your work to make it a national issue. It's a lot easier than we think to turn this country around. It never really takes more than 1% or less of engaged citizens on a major issue that has majority support. That's the critical thing. If it has majority support, like a full Medicare for all, everybody in, nobody out, and free choice of doctor and hospital, or restored minimum wage, or cracking down on corporate crooks and not bailing out Wall Street, it takes less than 1%. Wouldn't you think, Jim? Isn't that the history of the United States? It's always taken less than 1%, spearheading public opinion.
Yes, this, unreasonable people speak out and take action, confront power, spread the word, and then, lo and behold, people begin to get behind it. And as you say, people already are sympathetic to it. That happened with the minimum wage thing, the fight for 15. That came from the lowest paid, the least educated, the most vulnerable workforce in our society, fast food workers, who dared to walk off the job for a lunch hour or any time during the day, hold a rally, and then come back. And the community stood with those workers. When they came back, a minister would go in with them. A local small business person would go in with them. A local labor leader, a politician would go in with them. So the corporation was confronted with, don't you dare fire these people for exercising their First Amendment rights. And
Jim,
was
just to extend what you're saying, I remember we couldn't get Governor Cuomo to come out for a higher minimum wage in New York, which was stuck at $7.25 federal. And now look at the difference. Just because of what you described, he has now come out forceful for a $15 minimum wage for fast food workers.
Yeah.
So you see that?
I love it. Yeah. It happens in Seattle, Los Angeles, all across the country, and a lot of these independent chains of fast food places are saying, of course, we can pay $15 an hour. That's good. That means our people have got money in their pockets, and they're going to spend it here, or they're going to spend it here in our neighborhood, and a real economy develops.
That's right. Before we conclude, let me get your take on the Democratic Party in Texas. It's been a minority party. It's dominated by corporatist Republicans in the state legislature and the governorship. Is there a resurgence coming in Texas by the Democratic Party, and how do you see it?
There is indeed a resurgence. And what happened in Texas was not that the Republicans were ascendant or that suddenly the people turned right-wing. They quit voting. The people quit voting because my party, the Democratic Party, didn't stand up for them. It began to take those corporate checks and not talk about good jobs and good wages, not talk about the dirt farmers who are going broke and need public involvement, not talk about the health care for all, and et cetera. So, if you don't stand up for people, then people aren't going to stand up for you. And that's what happened to the party. So we had, in the last congressional election, 2014, lowest voter turnout in America, 28% of eligible voters.
28%? Wow.
Yeah. So that means these, Rick Perry, for example, the guy who put the goober in gubernatorial, Rick Perry and all these right-wing Republicans down here are getting elected with about 18% of the people of the state. And the pathetic thing is the Democrats have not been getting 19%. But now we're on the move by going back to classic organizing, back at the grassroots level. Yeah, you got to have money for TV, but you don't have to have as much of it if you've actually got people on the ground who are doing the kind of democratic work that results in democracy.
Well, the saying is, if the American people are ready, willing, and able, it's a lot easier for them to turn the country around and do it quickly than they ever thought possible. You got to be ready, willing, and able to enter the civic and political arenas, and you'll see that the preamble to the U.S. Constitution will continue to be we the people in reality instead of what it is now, seemingly we the corporations. Thank you very much, Jim Hightower, and his marvelous monthly newsletter, among other things, the Hightower Lowdown. And I hope you subscribe to it and connect with other lowdowners so that when push comes to shove, you're ready for a new type of justice and opportunity in America and its more peaceful relations around the world. Thank you very much, Jim Hightower.
Great to be with you, Ralph, not only on this show, but in the larger fight.
We've been talking to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist. Go to jimhightower.com to sign up for the Lowdown, hear his radio commentaries, and order his books. Now we're going to check in a moment here with Russell Mokhiber at the National Press Building. Russell?
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Report on Morning Minute for Thursday, October 8, 2015. I'm Russell Mokhiber. According to a report in the New York Times, J. Michael Pearson has become a billionaire from his tactics as the head of the fast-growing Valiant Pharmaceuticals International. And consumers like Bruce Manis, a 68-year-old retired carpenter from Granville, Michigan, are facing the consequences. Manis has been taking the same drug, cupramine, for 55 years to treat Wilson disease, an inherited disorder that can cause severe liver and nerve damage. This summer, Valiant more than quadrupled its price overnight. My husband will die without the medicine, said his wife, Susan, who is now working a second part-time job to help pay for the health care. We just can't manage another $2,000 or $3,000 a month for pills. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Russell does one of those every day for 5 days a week, and it seems like he never runs out of material. Thank you, Russell. Hi, everybody. Steve Scrovan here. This is a special announcement for our podcast audience, especially those of you who live in Southern California. I want to invite you to a stand-up comedy show that I am organizing to benefit the work of Public Citizen. It's called Stand Up for Main Street. It's going to be on Sunday, November 1st at the WGA Theater in Beverly Hills at 6:30 p.m. This is the 5th year in a row I've put this on, and it is always a fantastic evening of laughter and inspiration. In the past, we've had tremendous comedians like Bill Burr, Greg Fitzsimmons, Mark Maron, Ray Romano, Kevin Nealon, Dimitri Martin, Paula Poundstone, Jeff Garland, Don Marrera, Dana Gould, and many more. We've got another great show lined up for you this year. This year, we are featuring Gerard Carmichael of NBC's The Carmichael Show. We've got Brent Morin from the NBC show Undateable, Kira Sultanovich from The Tonight Show, Jimmy O. Yang from Silicon Valley, Beth Stelling, who's appeared on Conan and Jimmy Kimmel Live, my good friend Angelo Sarukis from Last Comic Standing, and the incomparable political satirist who is coming down special from San Francisco, Will Durst. And it's hosted by me, but don't let that deter you. That's Sunday, November 1st at the WGA Theater, 135 South Doheny in Beverly Hills at 6:30 p.m. showtime. Now, you regular listeners to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are familiar with the work of Public Citizen. Public Citizen is the group started by Ralph back in 1971, which has spent 44 years fighting for health, safety, and democracy, representing the interests of real flesh and blood people in the halls of power. We accept no corporate donations. We depend on the support of individuals to help us fight the good fight. We just heard from Jim Hightower, who is on the board with me, and we're about to hear from Lori Wallach, who is the tireless and fiery director of Public Citizen's Global Trade Watch Group. We've had President Rob Weissman on the show, along with Dr. Sid Wolf and Michael Carome. So go to citizen.org and click on the Stand Up for Main Street button. That will take you to the page where you can buy tickets. And even if you're not in the LA area, excuse me, and even if you're not in the LA area, you can help us out by going to Facebook, searching for Stand Up for Main Street 5, and sharing the post with your friends. So that's Sunday, November 1st, 6:30 p.m., WGA Theater for Stand Up for Main Street 5. Go to citizen.org for tickets. Now back to the show. Now, Ralph, David has some news for us in terms of this show.
We got word last week that there's a group of listeners in Portland, Oregon, who are forming a meetup to discuss issues facing the country based on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. They are promising lively discussions, good snacks, and wine. So if you are in the Portland area, why don't you Google the words Meetup Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and you'll find these people. And if there's anyone else around the country who is doing this or wants to create a listener meetup, we will do whatever we can to promote your group. And you can submit questions to ralphnaderradiohour.com, whether they are follow-ups to past shows or fresh topics, and we'll do our best to have Ralph answer them on the air. We'd like to make this as interactive as possible, so thanks to Russell Scheinberg in Portland for starting this meetup. What do you think of that, Ralph?
I think it's very encouraging, and once the conversation gets going, it'll eventually end up saying, okay, what are we going to do here? How are we going to impact our members of Congress, our state legislature? So activism then becomes more contagious. So everything starts with conversation, and it's about time we have more serious conversation in an internet age of rather minor-level text messaging.
So we're going to move on now to our next guest. And our next guest was actually name-checked in our earlier segment with Jim Hightower. We were talking about the TPP. Lori Wallach is a return guest on the show. She is the foremost expert in all of these global trade deals, the one who is pretty much ground zero from the beginning all the way back into the 90s. Lori is the director of the Global Trade Watch from Public Citizen. Welcome back, Lori Wallach.
Thank you so much.
All right, Lori, we're going to present to our listeners exactly what is about to happen. The press reported that there's an agreement reached called the Trans-Pacific Partnership with about a dozen Pacific Rim countries, including Canada, the U.S., Vietnam, and others. We still haven't seen the full text, and don't hold your breath as far as how long it's going to take for the American people to see the full text of one of the greatest sovereignty shredding proposed agreements. Now, you've been fighting NAFTA and World Trade Organization. You've got the premier website, globaltradewatch.org, for people who want clear, concise, what to do material and what it's all about. Can you give us a scenario of what we expect to see in the coming weeks and months as this agreement starts moving from the White House to Congress, which has to approve it?
Well, the place to start is, Ralph, where you just ended, which is, folks, the stuff I'm going to talk about is downright scary. It's really a bad deal for all of us, but it's only going to happen if Congress approves it. And that's where all of us as citizen activists can make sure we keep ourselves safe from this avoidable damage of the TPP. Congress is going to have to vote on it, and it's not going to happen until the beginning of next year. But the members of Congress are going to be making their decisions about what their positions will be soon. So they announced a deal. They haven't made the text public. They've been negotiating for 7 years in secrecy. It's a negotiation that has some of the world's biggest human rights violators, like Vietnam, like Malaysia, which everyone saw was in the news for the horrible human trafficking disasters. And these countries announced the deal. It's 30 chapters, and they are keeping the text secret still. We suspect that maybe Congress will get to see the text in the next 2-3 weeks. But under the law, under the outrageous fast-track law, they don't even have to make it public 30 days after they send it to Congress. And then 60 days after that, they can sign it. Once the agreement is signed, which probably will happen in the beginning of 2016, because of that fast-track mechanism, it ends up like a legislative luge run. They can just try and railroad it right through Congress, and that's why all of us, between now and the end of this year, need to pin down every single one of our representatives. The biggest fight's going to be in the House. And the overview of the deal's like this. It's everything bad that can happen with trade. More offshoring of American jobs. The incentives to offshore jobs that were in the NAFTA are in there, but worse. Downward pressure on our wages, because it's going to throw American workers right in direct competition with workers in Vietnam, where they make less than 60 cents an hour. More income inequality, a bigger trade deficit, which slows down economic growth. All of that stuff is the trade part. It is bad news for jobs, for the economy. But thing is, dirty little secret, only 6 of this monster agreement's 30 honking chapters have anything to do with trade. And Ralph, I hope you ask me what the other 24 have to do with, because it's like a trade agreement Trojan horse of corporate impositions that will make your food unsafe, your medicine too expensive, mess with your internet freedom, and let the banksters off their leash.
Well, you see, this is the biggest part of the so-called trade agreement is the displacement of our democratic institutions, which can be sidestepped by less developed countries who challenge our higher environmental, labor, and consumer standards, calling them non-tariff trade barriers, violating this Trans-Pacific Agreement. And this isn't decided in our courts. It isn't decided in our legislatures here. It isn't decided by executive branch. It's in secret tribunals, literally.
Every country has to conform its domestic laws to all these retrograde rules, literally in a so-called free trade agreement. They're new monopoly patent rights for the big pharmaceutical companies to jack up medicine prices and keep competition from generics and lower prices out of reach. There is a chapter in there that would ban Buy Local and Buy America. That has nothing to do with trade. That's just like a corporate boondoggle. There is a chapter in there that would extend copyright monopolies and make textbooks more expensive, make the big publishers more profit, could undermine our internet freedom. There's a chapter in there that could undermine financial regulation. All this stuff that has nothing to do with trade. And then there is the chapter in there that sets up the international tribunals that could undermine our domestic laws. And that's the so-called investor state system, where, thanks to TPP, if we don't all stop it, there would be 9,000 additional foreign corporations that are working in the U.S. that would have a new right to drag the U.S. government in front of some foreign tribunal of 3 private attorneys, not judges, private attorneys, who the next day could be suing the government, and those 3 attorneys get to act as judges. And behind closed doors at these international tribunals, these guys are empowered by TPP to order us, the U.S. taxpayer, to compensate these foreign companies unlimited sums. Why? Because they don't want to meet our U.S. health or safety or land use or any other kind of law. Same laws our companies meet. Those guys don't want them. They say it's a violation of their investor rights, and it might undermine their future expected profits. And so help me God.
This agreement, Laurie, let me interrupt you. This agreement has teeth. It has enforcement power. And tell us what the enforcement power is, and talk about this decision overturning our country of origin label on meat products in your supermarkets.
Well, number one, there's those tribunals I just talked about, and I was going to say, so help me God, corporations have as much power as a whole government. It's like being a country. It's not just corporate personhood. It's corporate statehood, because it's basically elevating an individual foreign company to equal power with the whole nation state to privately enforce a public treaty and raid our treasury just because they don't like our laws. Outrageous new powers created by TPP if we don't stop it in Congress. But then the other thing, Ralph, is what you're talking about is the way the enforcement works for all of these limits on imported food safety. Like, we're going to be flooded with shrimp from Vietnam that, hate to say it, but is grown in ponds of poop. And then they throw antibiotics in because the poop makes the shrimp sick, and then you're eating poopy antibiotic shrimp. And we're not even allowed to keep that stuff out under this agreement. And if we would, and this is what you're getting at, we get it challenged as an illegal trade barrier. And if we don't let that poopy shrimp in, make our kids sick, help, kill people, then we have to pay trade sanctions. It's enforceable. Our actual limits on our democracy are enforced with sanctions. And if this sounds too far-fetched, Ralph, what you're mentioning, there's a version of this at the World Trade Organization. And just 2 months ago, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, said, sorry, American consumers, you can't know where your meat and chicken comes from anymore. That law treats foreign and domestic meat the same. It just says, we all use that in the grocery store, the thing that says product of and that lists the country. Under the WTO, we've been ordered to get rid of that. And if we don't, us taxpayers are going to face hundreds of millions of dollars in sanctions. So we can either know we can have mystery meat or we can have our treasury raided. And that is the future if we don't stop TPP.
All right, Laurie Wallach, listeners about at this point are saying, this is incredible. How could this happen? How could President Obama, who graduated from the same law school as you did, Harvard Law School, be proposing this with enormous enthusiasm? What's in his mind? And why, secondly, isn't all these trade agreements deemed unconstitutional? Let's start with President Obama's mindset on this.
Well, the first piece of business is there. I don't know if I should be heartbroken or infuriated or maybe both, but he has taken this whole business on TPP hook, line, and sinker. And another of our law school friends, also in law school at the same time, Mr. Michael Froman, he's the chief trade ambassador, and he's a good friend of the president, and he's convinced the president every U.S. consumer group who's against TPP, every U.S. environmental group who's against TPP, all the labor unions, all the human rights groups, all the church groups, well, the entire Democratic base that got Obama elected, they're all crazy. They're all wrong. They don't know what they're doing. And this is the part that gets darn infuriating because he's been using the bully pulpit of the White House to push this. He's fighting harder for this more than he did for health care, more than he did for the bailout, more than anything. And it is really disgusting. But the thing that's great, Ralph, is there is this weird left-right coalition. I know you like that idea of the left-right coalition. And basically, there are a lot of conservatives who don't want to see the end of Buy America or corporate tribunals in some foreign court throwing out U.S. laws. No one wants to see more jobs offshore to wages pushed down. You got a lot of progressive members who are saying, what the heck with the pharmaceutical? It is constitutional if Congress approves it. It is stopped if Congress is not going to approve it. And so we are going to make sure that Congress doesn't approve it.
So your prediction is, when will this come to a vote next year? And what's your prediction? Right now, it's probably sort of split 50-50 or so in Congress. What's your prediction? And when do you think it's going to come to a vote? How much time do people have to go to your globaltradewatch.org, get the brilliant materials, clear, accurate, action-oriented materials?
And it's tradewatch.org. We took the global out, tradewatch.org, so it's faster to type in. You get all the materials you need. Or you can go to www.exposethetpp.org, and you can get everything you need. We will have probably a vote in the beginning of the next year. But what everyone needs to know, this number, 202-225-3121. That's 202-225-3121. You ask for your member of the House of Representatives. You ask for the Chief of Staff. Even if you're not exactly sure who your House member is, you can just give them your address. They'll connect you. And we need to do that
thank you
now. This is when they're making the decision.
We can win this. There's huge opposition, left, right, in the country. It's just got to focus on those 535 men and women in Congress. Already about half of them are leaning with us. We can win this big and begin turning the whole tide against corporate globalization that's undermining our country and about everything we stand for. Thank you very much, Lori Wallach.
Thank you.
We've been talking to Lori Wallach from Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Go to tradewatch.org for more information and call your representative at that number, 202-205-2221. That's 202-205-2221. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to get to your questions. Don't go away.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
We're going to go to some listener questions. Our first question is from Dave O. Rama. He says, "Hi, Ralph. Do you think that North American media has, over time, played a role in conditioning the public to accept the idea that institutionalized corruption is not only inevitable, but also acceptable?"
Well, I don't want to generalize on North American media because there's some good media like community radio and sometimes NPR, PBS, CBC, Canada. But what they have done is not reported it sufficiently. And when they have reported it, they haven't indicated what people can do about it. So that leaves people with the frustration when they see this corruption, say Pentagon contract corruption, or what the drug companies are gouging incredible prices of patients, even though some of these drugs are developed with taxpayer money. They leave people discouraged, and that often leads to cynicism or apathy. That's my problem. So what we have to do is take the good programs that are often on 60 Minutes or CBC and tell them, hanging at the end of the program, tell us what we can do.
Right, right. So it's not the reporting of it. For instance, we have Russell Mokhiber giving us something, he's got something every day that he can put out there, at least 5 days a week. And it can get overwhelming because you think, well, boy, how can you stop this? Or, this is just the way the game is played.
Well, it also, you see, there's far more exposés, even in the mainstream media, of corporate crime and fraud and abuse and raiding Medicare, et cetera, than we're doing about it as citizens. We always want more disclosure, more reporting, but we're not handling what is being presented to us so that we can call prosecuting attorneys and members of legislature saying, you got to have public hearing here. You got to enforce the law here. It doesn't take that much to get these people moving, but it takes something.
Dave, why don't you take the next question?
Adam Adrian Crown writes, the police have gone completely nuts and the prosecutors and courts are protecting them. What can we do to change that?
Well, again, that's a generalization because in most instances, day by day, the police behave themselves. There are bad apples, and there are cover-ups of bad apples by otherwise good police chiefs. So my proposal and many other reform groups are the following. There has to be a citizen review board. You can't have the police regulate themselves when there is police brutality, excessive force, shootings, innocent people, or not doing their job safekeeping the neighborhoods. They've been known in some instances to play hooky, or they favor higher income neighborhoods and they don't patrol poorer neighborhoods. Why don't you have a citizen review board? Then you got to have it enforceable. And that's where the controversy is. The police don't want a civilian review board above them, and they don't want enforceability. They want to be able to just have a slap on the wrist or suspend a police officer with pay for 5 or 6 weeks. And that's the wrong signal. Good police have to drive out bad police, and a citizen review board helps do that. The other thing is, if we have more community policing, we're going to have less police abuse. If the police live in the community, they know people, the old image of Officer Clancy walking down the street and everybody talking to him, and he knows the people's names and where the kids are going to school. We got to restore community policing.
Dave Smiraglino, sorry if I've mangled that, who writes, should I believe Bernie Sanders doesn't take money from corporations? And if elected, do you believe he will continue the war on terror?
Answer to the first question, he's set an all-time record of small contributions, resulting in $28 million so far that he's raised, and they're aiming for $75 million. He has not, to my knowledge, gone to any of the Wall Street big fat cat fundraisers or any of these big fat cat fundraisers around the country. And in terms of his foreign and military policy, he's got to fill in the blanks. There are a lot of people who are wondering about him. He voted for every military authorization bill in the Senate. He has not been particularly vociferous against what Obama has been doing and what George W. Bush before him has been doing over the country. And that's a question mark for Bernie Sanders if he's going to really take on in the debates and on the campaign trail Hillary Clinton, who is a dying-wool militarist and corporatist. She overrode the Secretary of Defense opposition to toppling the Libyan ruler, Gaddafi, and the disaster of that throughout Central Africa now, weapons, fighters, chaos, deaths, injuries, explosions. That was Hillary's war. And she's never met a war she didn't like. She never met a weapons system she didn't like. And that's what Bernie Sanders has got to go after.
Now, Carly Fiorina is rising as we speak in the Republican polls, and she's obviously a militarist based on what she said in the last debate. But she's also saying that we need a businessman or business person in the White House. What do you think of that?
Well, she was a disaster at Hewlett-Packard. They fired her. It was unanimous on the board of directors. She made an acquisition of Compaq, big computer company that was on the way down, and that sunk a lot of Hewlett-Packard's prospects and profits. The stock was down 55%. And then she has the nerve to say what America needs is someone who's experienced in business. I mean, this whole rise of Carly Fiorina is just a classic expression of what a circus a Republican presidential nomination is. Because what did she rise on? She rose on a couple of retorts about her looks and other things to Donald Trump. And she has this forceful, presentation with some alleged facts, and the papers have gone over her facts. She says things that are totally false, totally factually false, like the so-called video that has thrown Planned Parenthood to the wall, which is a doctored video. So that's the seamy, sordid state of American politics. And, as an electorate, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves, regardless of our political persuasion, that we've allowed the deterioration to a level of rancid demeanors and rancid bad candidates driving out potentially good candidates. It's like Gresham's Law, bad money driving out good money. We've got all kinds of people whose names people don't know who have worked for decades prudently and smart, are equipped to take political office, but they don't have a chance in this kind of bizarre, super PAC-dominated political circle with the fate of the most powerful country in the world at stake. Come on. We've got to start demanding with higher expectations what the candidates are putting before us. And we can do it one at a time, 10 at a time, million at a time. We just can't be spectators sitting back watching sports all the time or fretting and wringing our wrists and being cynical and dropping out of democracy.
Crystal Golick writes, "Hi, Ralph. Here's a crazy idea. You know how companies put obvious warnings on things like bags may cause suffocation? How about all weapons have to come with a warning on them saying all the ill effects it will cause when they're used?"
Are you talking about weapons? Did I hear you right?
Well, he's suggesting, for example, putting a warning label on guns, the same way we have warning labels on cigarettes.
Well, I would favor, for example, putting a label saying, do not put this weapon in reach of a youngster or a child, which is another way of saying store it away. There have been thousands of deaths where a 7-year-old picks up a weapon in his or her home and shoots a little sister or a little brother accidentally. So that certainly should come with a package of caveats and warnings.
It's impossible to sue a gun manufacturer in this country, right?
Yeah, just about. And that's because the gun manufacturers and the NRA got a bill through Congress a few years ago because some plaintiffs' lawyers were suing manufacturers for selling to known criminals or unscrupulous gun dealers, and they basically eliminated that remedy under tort law. So it's almost impossible now because of an act of Congress to do that. So it's just part of the growing immunity of corporations. They're not just satisfied with limited liability or caps on damages. They want immunity. This is another reason why we opened a few days ago the first law museum in America, the American Museum of Tort Law in Winston, Connecticut.
There's no class action suit you can envision against gun manufacturers? There's nothing you can do?
Not without repealing that law.
Michael Ferringer writes, Ralph, why not a no junk mail list? Save trees, oil, landfill space, and ID theft.
Well, it depends on your definition of junk mail. If junk mail is just these advertising circulars, you might have a case. But my mother once wrote an article for the post office's magazine saying she likes what is called junk mail from citizen groups, asking her for money because she gets caught up in what the environmental groups or the consumer or the labor or civil liberties groups are doing, because the letters are very well written usually and they're very descriptive, and it was an education. And she said even though she didn't contribute to every appeal, she contributed to some, it was an education. She refuses to call it junk mail.
Does junk mail help the post office? Does it help keep it?
That's the argument for it. The third-class commercial circulars, the advertising circulars, are a major portion of the post office's $70 billion budget. So maybe we have to tolerate it and try to get more first-class mail by learning the art of letter writing, teaching it to our children, which is what I tried to do with my recent book, Return to Sender, my unanswered letters to President Bush and President Obama. It wasn't just to inform people about what presidents, in my judgment, should be doing and saying and connecting with, but why not other people? I don't think more than 10 or 15% of the American people have ever written, even when they were youngsters, a letter to their president.
Well, thank you for your questions. Keep them coming. And I want to thank our guest today, Jim Hightower. Go to jimhightower.com and subscribe to the Hightower Lowdown. I do. And Lori Wallach, go to tradewatch.org and let's try to drive a stake into this TPP. For Ralph's weekly blog, go to nader.org. Remember to visit the country's only law museum, the American Museum of Tort Law in Winsted, Connecticut. Go to tortmuseum.org. If you have missed any of this show on the radio, go to ralphnaderradiohour.com or subscribe for free on iTunes or Stitcher. All of our shows are archived there with valuable links to our guests and their work. Start a meetup group. Let's make this interactive. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. On behalf of David Feldman, I'm Steve Scrovan. Talk to you next week, Ralph.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jimmy. And let's rumble here. Let's get active as citizens. Talk to your neighbors, friends. Spread the word about the program and all the active opportunities to reshape our country in terms of our own pretensions and ideals.
Thieves in the temple, too much money changing hands. really very simple. Just make a list of demands.
From Pacifica, you've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Special thanks to John Richard, Matthew Marin.
Our graphic designer is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our editor is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our board operator is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
Oh, what the hell. Let's make him our producer.
Our producer is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
And thanks to our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
And most importantly, special thanks to Mr. Ralph Nader, www.nader.org.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, is written and performed by Kemp Harris.
If you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as a podcast and would like to listen to it as a broadcast,
call your local radio station and say, I want the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
He's Steve Scrovan.
I'm Steve Scrovan. He's David Feldman.
Until next time.
Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you. Listen to me, people. Do you understand? We